incredible curiosity for the world. Very quickly realized that I was much better off in the life sciences and switched over to studying biology, chemistry, and nutrition. My undergraduate studies were in those fields. And I originally thought that I would become a medical doctor or a chiropractor. And so I went down that pathway for a while, but very quickly realized that I didn't have the passion for cracking people's bones or for giving people pharmaceutical drugs as I did for acupuncture or Chinese medicine. So I finished my graduate studies in Chinese medicine from a school in Southern California and came back here to Colorado, my home state, in 2008. I've been in practice since then. And since then I've seen thousands of clients in Denver, Boulder, Evergreen, Breckenridge. Those are the main places where I practice. I've been practicing in Boulder. We're actually blessed to have another Boulder acupuncturist with us tonight. I'm sorry, tell me your name again.
Margaret Hampton.
Margaret, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a highly educated audience in tonight. So if I make any mistakes, we have people that are going to check me on. So Chinese medicine is a really unique philosophy because it comes from a very, very old philosophy that the purpose is to help people come back to nature. It's based on Taoism. And Taoism is a 3,500-year-old or 5,000 years old or maybe 10,000-year-old science. We don't really know. The oldest texts that we have are at least 3,500 years old. But it comes from a very old culture in ancient China. And their main philosophical purpose is to reconnect mankind and nature. And the interesting thing that's implicit about that is it suggests that there's a disconnection. So we don't need to be reconnected unless we've already been severed from that relationship. So I found it to be a very powerful approach. And then in the process of studying Chinese medicine, of course, we're exposed deeply to Western medicine, to physiology, to psychology, to embryology. And so I've really attempted over the years to blend my own philosophy with a philosophy of art and science that helps make sense of this ancient Asian philosophy within the context of the culture that I was born and raised in. So I've spent a lot of time studying evolution. And so there's some really interesting things that come from the evolutionary field that I'll hope to present to you. Time check here. I can talk for way too long, so I think we have somebody to check.
You have 40 minutes.
40 minutes, okay, very good. So one of my early Western influences was a man named Theodosius Dobzhansky. He's actually a Russian physiologist, and he wrote an essay in the early 70s, and he said something like, nothing in biology makes sense outside of the light of evolution. And meaning that we tie everything back to our evolutionary processes. And many things about human life and about human physiology, human health, are opaque. They're not understandable. They're mysterious until we start to look at them through the evolutionary lens. And sleep is one of those things. Because there's really, think about our ancient ancestors, right? That's the sort of frame of mind that we get into to think about evolution, is to realize that we've been on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years in this form, that we're anatomically modern humans 70,000 years ago, and the culture that we live in today really only started to emerge about 10,000 years ago. So where people were running around looking like we do now, but living totally differently up until really very recently. We're very vulnerable when we sleep. To predators, to enemies from a different tribe, to pests and disease, to things that could harm us. And all mammals sleep. So why would evolution design this incredible vulnerability into our system? Any guesses? To stay alive, right? But what advantage does that perform?
Regeneration.
It's regeneration, right? Obviously, it's regeneration. We know that regeneration is very, very critical. And it just turns out that we would just wear ourselves out through sheer, grinding our bones and joints and our neurons to dust if we didn't sleep. But now, because of modern science, we have measurements to know what happens when we lose sleep. And so here's the other side of the coin, is we've had these incredible adaptations over the last 50 or 100, 200 years, really just the last 5 years, right? The last 10 years, with all the technology that we have. Actually, one of the unique value propositions of Castle Marne here is that it brings us back to a slightly lower tech state of mind, a slightly lower tech environment, which can really have value when it comes to health and wellness. And Ellen, I'm sure, will speak to that in future talks. So we won't go too far into
I'll
that.
write that down.
But we know that modern humans are sleeping less and less because we didn't evolve with the electric light bulb. We didn't evolve with the blue screen of our cell phones. In fact, I've actually show you a quick little hack here. So I've got a little speed dial button here where I could turn my phone red to try to limit the blue light exposure, which we're going to talk more about. But even this, if you hold this up to a wall in the dark, it still looks blue because these have more blue pixels than anything else. And going back to evolution, over millions of years, now going back to the entire history, the Earth has been around for about 5 billion years. All life on Earth is actually adapted to the light stimulus. So from an evolutionary perspective, light is the most important thing to understand when it comes to sleep. You all understand, or everybody heard of the Doppler shift? You ever notice when a car goes by you on the highway, the sound kind of changes? It goes, right? Kind of like it's higher.
That's really good.
Higher pitch when it's coming towards you, and lower pitch as it's going away. The sound of the car is not changing, right? That engine tone is the same, or the wind whistling by you is the same. It's the fact that as that object is approaching us, the sound wavelengths are compressing, therefore making them higher wavelength. And as it's moving away from us, the motion of that vehicle away from us is drawing those wavelengths out, so the sound becomes lower. The same thing happens with light. The Earth is spinning relative to the sun, and as we spin towards the sun in the morning, the wavelengths compress a little bit and we get more blue light in the morning. And then as we spin away from the sun in the afternoon, late afternoon into evening, the light draws out, so we get more orange and red wavelength. And this has been happening for so long that every living cell on Earth, unless it's down deep in the soil or deep in the ocean, this is true of plant life as well. I'm here to tell you, in the cannabis industry, they figured this out with the lights they use in the grow rooms. That blue light is very stimulating. It's uplifting. It increases serotonin. It increases dopamine. It increases norepinephrine, all of the stimulating hormones. Red light decreases those substances and increases things like melatonin to help you rest. These things, and your television at home, and your laptop, and a lot of the LED light bulbs and the compact fluorescent light bulbs have lots and lots of blue light. And so what do those things do? It suppresses melatonin. And melatonin, a lot of people actually have some mistaken ideas about melatonin. Who here knows what melatonin is? Who here has used melatonin? Okay, so melatonin.
You don't know what it is, but you've used it. Totally understood.
Melatonin is a sleep hormone. And I use the word hormone very, very carefully and intentionally because in Europe, it is sold as a hormone. It is not available over the counter. You can go practically to a gas station here or to a natural grocer or Whole Foods or order it from Amazon. It's a very, very powerful hormone, but it does not induce sleep like a sleep drug, which we'll talk about in a bit. What it does is it advances the circadian clock, our internal clock mechanism, to tell us that it's time to go to sleep. So it's like our little alarm clock that says, you should be tired now. Aren't you ready to go to sleep? It doesn't actually, it's like the little tripwire that actually tells us to go to sleep. It's not the mechanism itself. So melatonin is, we could really say that most modern humans have an acquired deficiency of melatonin due to light pollution. And so this is why Americans are sleeping less and less. And I think the study that I saw, actually this first talk, I put the first sleep talk together I think about 6 or 7 years ago. I've given a version of this probably 4 or 5 times since then. And in the time that since I first gave this talk, I think our average sleep duration is reduced by like 12 minutes on average. So we're losing like 4 or 5 minutes of sleep per year on average. So within 20 years or so, nobody's gonna be sleeping. And that's a real problem because as you lose sleep, you lose neurological efficiency. In fact, if you're underslept by 50%, it's the same level of neurological impairment as being drunk to the level of a DWAI, having a blood alcohol of 0.05. So you lose motor coordination, you lose reaction time efficiency. These things start to go away, and the more sleep that you lose, the more that builds up. The more, in fact, you can measure in terms of REM sleep. And the body actually is quite resilient. We can overcome that. This is called sleep debt, right? When you lose sleep for one night, actually, we would say, like let's say you don't sleep at all. Then on average, a human gets about 100 minutes of REM sleep. That's the dreaming sleep, but that's the most restorative sleep that we get. If you allow yourself to sleep as much as you can the next night, you can just sleep in and go to bed early, you'll actually sleep 200 minutes, which is twice the average. After 4 or 5 days, though, you can no longer repay that sleep debt. It's just gone. It's like you've lost it to the Grim Reaper. Cue Shakespeare. So sleep is very, very important. It's estimated that it costs us billions of dollars a year. I think the number is something in the range of 20 billion. When you do the math individually, underslept people are costing themselves economically either through accidents, illnesses, injuries, or lost productivity, somewhere between $10,000 and $60,000 a year in terms of lost income, lost happiness, lost health and wellness. So then the question becomes, in my remaining time, and I can go on and on about this. We have questions. I'll open this for questions later. So we'll try to pivot now to solutions. How do we sleep better? And so the first thing that we need to really look at is light and light pollution, because it's, from an evolutionary perspective, it's primary. Second thing, who wants to take a guess what the second most important circadian rhythm timing element might be?
Habits.
Sure, generally speaking. There's one specific habit, there's one specific thing we do to our body that really influences our body's mechanism that tells us that we're tired, that we need to go to sleep.
Eating.
That's it. So food and light are your two most important circadian rhythm timing experiences that we can have. And so from a practical perspective, we want to actually bias our day. We want to organize or engineer our day so that we're getting lots of blue light in the morning, preferably sunlight, and we're getting our largest dose of calories earlier in the day. So big breakfast, big lunch, smaller dinner, earlier dinner. Totally going to violate that tonight because I'm going to go out to eat dinner after that, after this tonight. But these are the things that cause what we would call circadian advance. And a circadian advance is when your bedtime gets later and later and later, and pretty soon, if we're left to our own devices, like me, you'll be going to bed at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and sleeping until 9 or 10 in the morning, or later perhaps. This is natural. College students experience this, right? Teens and college students are known for this. And in fact, human volunteers in sleep experiments have been shown, if they're not given a clock and they're not given light from the environment to time their circadian rhythm, everyone will do that. But teenagers and young adults do it more. And they'll actually entrain to like a 25 or 26 or 27 hour daylight cycle. So the days just keep getting longer and longer unless we entrain our bodies to the natural rhythms of the biosphere, to food and to light. So with that, I'll shift gears a little bit, because I know we're running out of time, and I want to make sure I give time for questions. Is that there are really two major classes of sleep disorder. We could call them onset insomnia and maintenance insomnia. So who here has ever experienced insomnia in some way, shape, or form? Right? Pretty much everyone, right? Anybody experience it chronically or is still experiencing it? Okay. And some people have experienced it and treated it, been able to come out of that. Who has trouble falling asleep? Okay. Have trouble falling asleep sometimes? That's your onset insomnia. This typically has to do with what we talked about, phase advance, where your circadian rhythm just hasn't quite figured out that it's the right time to go to bed. Your sleep alarm clock just hasn't gone off yet. The other thing that happens is that we're really stimulated, the brain is really active, we tend to be in an active thought mode, and when that happens, there are competing neurological circuits, the dopamine circuit, the norepinephrine circuit, that prevent us from going into sleep mode. An interesting study I learned about from a good friend of mine who's a geneticist is that if you are lying in bed thinking about physical tasks. So in other words, if you're a yoga teacher, for example, a movement teacher, or you have a physical job, or maybe you're remodeling your house and you're thinking about these physical processes in your brain, how you're going to move your body or instruct other people to move their bodies, you actually activate your cerebellum. And when you activate your cerebellum, it decreases your ability to go into sleep. So you don't want to be rehearsing movements or thinking about moving three-dimensional objects before you go to sleep, because it's giving your brain a movement stimulus, which runs counter to the stimulus for us to fall asleep.
It's like counting sheep's terrible.
Right.
There they are, jumping over the fence.
Well said, well said, absolutely. So that's onset insomnia. The other one is called maintenance insomnia. And maintenance insomnia is when, and people can have both. Maintenance insomnia, though, is when people have trouble maintaining sleep, so they tend to wake up at night. And actually, Chinese medicine gives us an incredible lens for this, because Chinese medicine, over thousands of years of observation, noticed that each organ has a peak of activity. So for about a 2-hour window every day, the same time every day, each organ is at its peak of activity and has a corresponding period 12 hours later when that organ is at its low ebb of activity. And based on this clock, we can understand which organs are imbalanced. And from that, actually, there's a lot of really interesting cross-cultural implications. So the most common one that we see actually is the liver and gallbladder. In our modern society, with alcohol, with all the different foods present, caffeine, different stimulants that we use, it tends to put a very strong load on the liver. And when the liver isn't happy, it's a very medical term, by the way, unhappy liver. It's a pissed off liver. From a Western physiological perspective, what happens when you go to sleep at night, your liver actually dilates. It becomes about 3 to 5% larger. It accepts a lot more blood flow into it. There are over 500 different metabolic functions that happen in your liver. It digests all your food, and from some perspective, it digests all your experiences. It's doing a lot of living for us, right? That's why it's named the way that it is. And when those processes do not happen in a smooth and organized way, it disrupts sleep maintenance. So often one of the most important things you can do is to address your liver health. And of course, I would recommend you speak with a practitioner, a naturopath, an acupuncturist, a functional medicine doctor, someone who really is studied and experienced in the practice of unfolding these sleep disorders to understand which organ. It may not be the liver, gallbladder, it could be the heart, it could be an emotional or psycho-emotional spiritual issue. It could be a digestive disorder. Actually, digestive disorders are in the list of organ problems that interrupt sleep. Conditions like acid reflux, GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, can be very disruptive to sleep. In fact, there's a syndrome where acid reflux will reflux into the lungs and cause coughing and asthma type symptoms based on the fact that there's now highly acidic digestive fluid in the lungs. And people don't even realize that this is happening. They just know they can't sleep. So they go to the doctor and they get a scope. The doctor uses an endoscope to figure out, maybe they complain of a sore throat at the same time, and find out that there's stomach acid that's in fact refluxing from the digestive tract into the lungs. So long story short, there are a number of organ systems and organ patterns that can disrupt sleep. Outside of that, let's look at a couple of other things that can affect sleep. So we have light, we have food. What's another one? Anyone have another?
You have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night.
Ah, great one. Actually, very good. Yes.
As we get older.
Yes. So
Or
that's
when you're
another
pregnant.
interesting one.
Yeah.
So kidney metabolism. Yeah, and so in Chinese medicine, we would talk about your kidney qi, which is qi just really means function, your kidney energy. Its ability to process, and it does tend to degrade over time, but it doesn't have to. So it's very ironic. The kidney is an interesting organ in that the less efficient it is, the more water it uses to do its job. So a highly efficient kidney does its job with less water, therefore you can sleep through the night, you don't have to urinate. A less efficient kidney needs more water, and therefore you fill up your bladder and you have to wake up to urinate. So one of the solutions then is to fix that kidney, bladder metabolism through herbal practices and through nutrition. Actually, one of the key causes that causes a lot of problems in kidney metabolism is diabetes and diabetes-related disorders, because the kidney, essentially, in layman's terms, the kidney gets gummed up with carbohydrates and carbohydrate byproducts. And if you can fix that problem, you can often delay the need or at least offset. Instead of having to wake up 3 times a year, you might only have to wake up once. Or maybe it's only every 2 nights, or only if you drink alcohol, or only if you drink too much water before bed. And on a regular basis, you may be able to sleep through the night. So water and hydration is another. Any others that people can think of? There's often a difference between male preference for this and female preference for this.
Sex.
Cheers, indeed. We are different.
Nathan, you're invited to every single one.
Yes. We'll have a whole other series of talks on that. Leave that aside for now.
Yeah.
Really, I was thinking about temperature, which is related, right? You get really revved up, your temperature goes up, and then your temperature goes down. No, with the sleep hormone melatonin, one thing that it does is it brings the body temperature down. And there's a relationship, a reciprocal relationship between body temperature and your ability to produce melatonin. And there's a difference between male preference and female preference because we have some metabolic differences. Men typically have a little stronger metabolism, a little more muscle tissue, a little stronger thyroid function, and we're not built to birth babies, right? So men tend to prefer to sleeping in a slightly cooler environment than women, but nonetheless, most people's sleeping environment is probably, if you're sleeping with your normal thermostat set at 69 or 70 degrees, it's probably 5 or 6 degrees too hot. Optimal sleep temperature for most people is somewhere in the low 60s. And so the great thing about that is now we have these programmable thermostats, which I never even messed with mine until I learned this. It's like, why do I care what temperature it is? I'm just gonna leave it at the same temperature all the time. But programmable thermostats are an option. The other thing that's available, and we find this especially true for athletes, for people who have outside physical jobs and are therefore exposed to cold stress a lot, people that work in the ski industry in Colorado, in the construction industry, is that they tend to sleep even hotter than most other people. And so now we have these really cool devices. There's one called the Chili Pad. It's essentially, it's a little, it has a glycol chiller that sits off to the side of your bed and runs cool fluid through a pad underneath you to keep your body cool, to keep you down at an optimal temperature level. And there's a different zone for your spouse, so that if your spouse has cold feet, she can put her zone up to 85 and take care of those cold feet. While the person who sleeps hot can have that cool pad down in the low 60s. So with that, I think I'll take a pause here for some questions, and we can discuss any questions you might have about sleep hygiene. We can, if there are no questions, I'll jump into supplements. We can talk about some supplements that are supportive. But before I do that, I want to take any questions.
I'm curious about, there's some, I don't know, areas of thought that talk about different phases of sleep, like it's normal to wake up at 4 in the morning and meditate or something, and then some people go back to sleep, but some people stay awake, and I'm curious how that fits in with kind of the current consensus on sleep hygiene.
Great question. So I think it depends a lot on your activity levels and on your metabolism. Some people do seem to have a natural waking point that's very early in the day. From a Chinese medicine perspective, that can be associated with dysfunction, but it doesn't have to be. It can be normal. The differentiating factor is what other symptoms are present. So if there's some other digestive disorders, maybe some reproductive disorders that are present, then we might look at that as being dysfunctional. But if all of the other systems appear to be healthy and there are no other physiological problems present, then we would look at that as just a normal quirk of metabolism. We're all different. We all have some variation in our circadian rhythms.
What about the intersection of sleep and intermittent fasting?
Good question.
I'm sorry.
So I practice intermittent fasting myself. Anybody here not know what that is? Okay, so intermittent fasting is what we might call a restricted feeding window. Feeding is such a yes, I'm about to enter my feeding window. Would you like to attend a feeding ceremony with me? It's essentially just compressing the time of day when you allow yourself to eat. And there's a really interesting thing that happens there. So the studies show that you can have people on the same diet. They're eating the same foods, the same total calories, the same grams of fat, protein, carbohydrates, all this stuff. It's all the same. If they spread it out, they have a greater insulin signaling and a greater metabolic load, which translates to more weight gain and more difficulty losing weight, versus having it in a more of a compressed window where maybe 8 hours, maybe 6 hours, maybe 4 hours. Some people are taking it to an extreme, but they'll eat the same calories in a shorter period of time throughout the day. And those people, again, same amount of calories, same fat, same carbohydrates, they'll actually have a better metabolic effect. They'll have an easier time losing weight, losing fat. They'll have an easier time gaining muscle if they're training, if they're doing strength training to gain muscle. They typically sleep better. It's helpful for inflammatory problems. We see lower levels of inflammation. So intermittent fasting is a really powerful modality. The one thing that happens though, the challenge that people face in intermittent fasting is that most people want to wake up. This is what I do when I'm dysfunctional. Is just wake up and start working. Like wake up and go to work. I work from home a lot, but I could just like wake up and start my day. And I don't eat anything, and I could go all day long. My insulin pathways are good. I don't need to eat anything, and all of a sudden it's 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and I'm ready for like 2,000 calories, 2,500 calories, right? And that's great, except that now my body has to process all of that, and it's very difficult for the body to process all of those calories and try to get to sleep.
Yeah.
So ideally, for intermittent fasting purposes, you want to actually have a big meal first thing in the morning, and then maybe a big lunch, and then skip dinner. That would be the ideal practice for intermittent fasting. It's not always feasible, travel, things like that, but that circadian signal does really change the way our body goes to sleep. And one of the worst things you can do, another study shows, is to eat a big meal and then go right to sleep. Because on an isocaloric diet, meaning, again, all the calories are the same calories, same fat, same carbs, same protein, if they eat that big meal right before bed, it's gonna go right to your waistline, which is the last place you want it. It's the least healthy healthy place to have a lot of body fat, because it shows that there's a metabolic problem. So, hope that answers your question.
Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question.
Actually, to follow up on that, because my doctor has me on this thing. So, and her take with my lifestyle and whatever, is that if I can stop eating by 7 p.m.,
Yes.
this is for me specifically, and then have 4 ounces of nuts or cheese or something within, if I can wait 14 hours.
Yes.
That's her
Okay.
opinion.
Good.
And have something to like kick off,
Mm-hmm.
this is again her description, I'm not medical, to kick off that metabolism, and then wait another couple hours, preferably till lunch, and then have a bigger meal then. Does that, sound like a reasonable fit? And obviously everybody's different.
Yeah.
But
That absolutely fits. That's a perfect. So you'd be having a 14-hour fasting window and a 10-hour eating window during the day. That's pretty classical intermittent fasting, and it definitely gets the job
and
done.
try to focus the main part, like lunchish, whatever, middle of the day, and
Yes.
not as much.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the old rule of thumb or the aphorism from our grandmother. It's breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. Something like that. Have you all heard that saying before? It really is true. There's really a lot of wisdom in some of these ancient practices that have been handed down to us from our grandparents. Cool. Any other questions?
Is exercising in the evening not so good for sleep?
Great question. So something relaxing, like a more gentle yoga class, a yin yoga class, gentle cardio can be beneficial for sleep, but we find that people that perform this kind of high intensity interval training, a really aggressive yoga class, strength training later in the day, it tends to jack up all of your stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and that makes it harder to sleep. And so for most people, it's better to get those things in earlier in the day if you can.
Is there like a window of time that's ideal, like you want you know, however many hours before you go to bed is like a safe window of time to exercise?
I think it really varies on the person, and so for me, what I found is it's probably 3 or 4 hours is a good minimum. Like I need at least 3 or 4 hours after a heavy workout before I can expect to be relaxed enough to go to sleep.
Okay.
Do you have any opinions on napping?
Napping is really interesting. Great question. So there's some really interesting studies on napping. Ironically, I don't know if this is ironic or not, I find it interesting. I find it kind of counterintuitive in that napping has actually been shown to improve your sleep quality at night, with certain caveats, is that if you go into a full REM cycle, it may disrupt your sleep that evening. So sleeping more than about 45 minutes is going to push your body into a full REM cycle. So the sweet spot seems to be 30 minutes or less, 15, 20 minutes in there. Those quick naps tend to be very restorative while not starting the full sleep cycle process.
Thank you.
Power nap. Indeed. I'm a practitioner.
So would that napping thing be applicable to the blue light as well?
Yes, so let's talk about blue light. It's advisable to discontinue blue light at least 2 hours before bed. And I'm the worst at this. I have a real challenge. If you have to be on a device, there are a number of what are called e-ink reader devices. Amazon makes one, it's the Amazon Paperwhite Kindle, and then there are a number of other companies. And so these are devices that are only black and white, and they're designed to have a reflectivity that looks like paper. So when you're looking at the screen, it looks like actual printed paper. It doesn't look like the screen on your cell phone. In other words, it's not back illuminated. They've used a very low luminosity screen, and these devices seem to have a lot less potential to damage your circadian rhythms compared to these high intensity blue light emitting devices. The other thing you can do is these devices all have, in your settings, they all have accessibility for people with visual or hearing impairment, and in the color filter section, you can turn on, and you can even make it go into a hotkey like this, so now my screen is completely red. So this is reducing the blue light. There's still blue light. Again, if I were to turn off all the lights, even though this looks completely red, turn off all the lights in here, hold it up against the wall, you'll see a little bit of a blue hue. You can't completely turn off all those little tiny blue LEDs in the screen, but you can turn them down a whole lot, and you can turn up the red ones. So these are an option as well. Yes?
So what's the weird thing then about when you're sitting home on the couch and you're watching TV and it's 10 o'clock and you start nodding off and everything, and then you go to bed and I seem to sleep fine? Because it's maybe not the same blue light, obviously, as when you're looking at this little screen right in your face.
Exactly. It's a function of the joules or watts per square meter and the intensity close to your face. So if you were to sit that close to your